Hello everybody, and today I just want to rant. Why? Because why? Why not? Yeah, come on. I know now to say swear words because copyright, algorithm, and other nonsense for some reason that YouTube doesn't like. Oh no. But yeah, I want to talk about how Caribbean history is so underrated. Seriously, if you look in a history textbook, an academic or a PhD dissertation or thesis or whatever you want to call it, right? How often do you find that actually covers about the Caribbean? Yeah, I don't mean like Latin American history and occasionally mention the islands, because there's 40 islands pretty much, or 43 islands in the Caribbean. So, but no, there's never. It's barely you find topics about Caribbean history. Especially if you focus on the very Pacific. For example, I'm a anarchist, communist, atheist. So, how often you gonna find topics that specific related to the Caribbean? It's like that one example you find in a meme post about anarchist history, like the pool where the mother's holding the baby, but there's another girl drawing. You see the face of despair. It's like the mother is basically European American anarchism, right? And then you see the holding the baby, right? Which is basically almost exclusively like the American anarchism, British anarchism, and then you have the baby drowning, which is Spanish anarchism or Latin American anarchism. Then you see underwater the skeleton, which is Asian anarchism and African anarchism. But I would go a step further, like underground, under the ocean, where the core of the planet is Caribbean anarchism. Seriously, if you Google any book, scholarly book about the history of anarchism in the Caribbean, you can only find four books. You heard me right. There's only four books ever published about the history of anarchism in the Caribbean. Two of them are from Puerto Rico. One is called Black Flag Boricua, and the other is Libertarian Voices. The other book is Cuban Anarchism, the History of the Movement. Remember, all of these were published in the 2000s or the 2010s. In only 2020, they released a book about Caribbean anarchism in general. And even then, it only focused about exclusively to Puerto Rico and Cuba, and sometimes Dominican Republic, and to a lesser extent Panama, which is Central America, and Peru, which is South America, because it has a transatlantic communication at the time. But still, and the reason was the same thing goes with the history of free thought, skepticism, atheism, agnosticism, deism in the Caribbean. There is not a single book, to my knowledge, about the history of atheism or any like anti-religious sentiment in the Caribbean. Este, the basically it's almost not existent. And even then, if you look at the history of atheism in Puerto Rico, for example, like it didn't start the popularity up until the 2010s, during the final years, the heyday of the new atheist movement. Like it swears, like it's almost not existent, to be honest. Like if you look at the history of atheism, etc., in the Caribbean, you can find barely any information, and it only started to become somewhat of a popularity up until the 2010s with the rise of the new atheist movement. The only other, Cuba is the only exception when Castro started the Cuban Revolution because they wanted to state atheism. So yeah, that's the only exception, right? But besides that, no. And the oldest sources and like people and like anything that relates to atheism and Gnosticism, skepticism, hell, even deism, like it only go as far back to the 1900s, where it's during the anarchist movement in Puerto Rico. But in other islands outside Cuba and Puerto Rico, there's barely any history of socialism, communism, or anarchism in the Caribbean. Dominican Republic has some exception, but for the most part, they didn't have their own socialist movements up until the 60s or 70s after the Cuban Revolution. And at the same time, all the islands that are still colonies, because Puerto Rico is not the only one, it's the oldest one, but not the only one, they didn't start their own independence movement up until the 60s. and 50, shortly after the Cuban Revolution. Before that, there was no independence movement. If it did, it was just like a couple, like a small group of friends at best. Like it's extremely uncommon to find the history of independence movement and decolonization in the Caribbean outside of Puerto Rico and Cuba and Haiti and Dominican Republic. And there's also, like I said, there's only 4 books ever published about anarchism in the Caribbean. There's not a single scholarly book about atheism or irreligious thinking in general in the Caribbean. The only way to know about that, you have to read about the history of anarchism when they occasionally mention them, or to study about state atheism in Cuba, but that's about it. But another interesting topic besides that is Freemasonry. This is another interesting topic that people often forget about, because when people think of Freemasonry, people think exclusively England, Scotland, and the United States. That's it. Well, in reality, it's all over the world, and you can find a lot of books about the history of Freemasonry in in Europe, Africa, Asia, China, Japan. Like there's a lot of information. Some of them are more obscure than others, but regardless. But there's only one book, and I repeat, only one book ever published about the history of Freemasonry in the Caribbean. It's called Writing in Secrecy. That's the only book you're gonna find about the topic. And when it comes to Pacific Islands, there's no book about the history of Freemasonry in Cuba or Dominican Republic or nothing. There's barely anything. There's websites that has articles that talks about to an extent, but there's barely anything. There is a book about history of Freemasonry in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. There's only one book about that. There is a 26-page PDF article about Freemasonry in the Swedish Caribbean in Saint Barthélemy, but like it's only 26 pages. And there is a book about Pacific Lodge in the island Martinique. Not the history of Freemasonry in the island, just the Pacific Lodge, right? That's it. One Pacific Lodge of a Pacific island. One about the Swedish Caribbean that only has 26 pages. And there are only one book about Pacific Island, which is Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. That's it. That's all you need. There's only one book about Pacific Island, and there's only one book about the Caribbean as a whole. It's like Caribbean is a very, very obscure topic, right? Even though I made 90 plus videos about the history of Puerto Rico, I had to delete all of those videos because of copyright and be shut down and censorship and got banned because exposing the truth about U.S. imperialism and colonialism of the island, of massacres, human experimentation, bombings, crime against humanity, war crimes, like etc. They did horrible shit, but they didn't want to acknowledge that. So, like I said, it's a very underrated topic. It's very obscure. Hell, I have more knowledge about Australian anarchism and the history of philosophy in Australia and New Zealand than I know about the Caribbean. That's how obscure it is. There's more information about philosophy in New Zealand and Australia than there is anything about the Caribbean that shows you the true history of our struggle. If that is not type of mental censorship of the true history, I don't know what the fuck it is.